terrible.
So we start this conversation. You hear chuckling, but it's really sort of we're laughing instead of to avoid crying, I think. This is Sharon Kyle of the LA Progressive, welcoming the LA Progressive community to a conversation that I am having with friend, um, and her name is Kim Wilson. And we scheduled this conversation long before we even thought about the election. That wasn't the reason for the conversation. The reason for the conversation is that Kim and Maya Schenwar of Truth Out have a book that's coming out in November the 17th or 19th.
19th, November 19th.
November the 19th. And the book is We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition. So Kim, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And we can just pick this conversation up and just let it organically do what it does.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Thanks for having me. And yeah, like you said, we scheduled this before, the events of yesterday and the outcome. And while that's not the focus of our conversation, it feels, like we can't ignore it either, right? Like we can't pretend that that's not happening, right? Because again, when we're talking about issues about parenting, and particularly the book explores issues around parenting and abolition, we can't ignore the, fascist settler colonialism, genocidal, forces that are in power and have been. And to be clear, I want to be careful because I can let my emotions kind of run away with me in this moment, but I also want to be measured because I feel that the outcome would not have mattered, right? That unless we are both sides support genocide, and we need to acknowledge that.
Right.
And that, the outcome, while it, and there's two things, right? And I think it's complex, but it's also very simple at the same time. So I wanted to, put that out there, and we can think through that, but again, it was just something that we were chatting about before we started recording, and and it just felt like it had to be said because we have to talk about it. We have to get it off our chests. We have to give ourselves time to grieve and time to feel it and time to regroup, right? And reflect and really let this sink in and figure out what comes next, right? A lot of us who are organizers and, longtime organizers, abolitionists, we have been having this conversation for a very long time. And I don't think it changes the work that we do. And I think that for some people, it may give it more of a sense of urgency. But again, I've been feeling that sense of urgency, and so have a lot of other people for a very long time.
Yeah. So I want to talk about, the work that we do and the need to not let what happened yesterday. So yesterday was November the 5th, 2024, and there was a majorly consequential election where Donald Trump has been declared the winner. But we're not going to let that define what we do or don't do about this country. I personally, and I certainly hope that you share this feeling, I believe that this country is my country. And I need to shape it to be the kind of society that I want to live in, that I want my children to live in, and that I want my grandchildren to live in. So just a presidential election is not going to stop me from doing the work that I do. And I think that there really is a connection between parenting and creating the kind of country we want. And it's so important that you and Maya have done this book, We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition. So let's talk about abolition. And what does it mean?
In short, and I'm not trying to be flip, it means getting rid of things, but it also simultaneously means building things up, right? Building good things, getting rid of bad things, building up good things. And, as someone who's been involved in prison abolition for a very long time, my work, my goal, my focus has been, fighting against these death-making systems. But within that, when we talk about prison abolition, it encompasses all of these different systems, right? We can't talk about prison abolition and not talk about things like reproductive justice. We can't talk about prison abolition and not talk about trans rights or education or healthcare or housing or anything else. So it's a very broad way of thinking about, it's a political vision, and a way to organize against these death-making and death-loving systems that are killing us, right? They're killing all of us. And yeah, I think the book is a timely contribution and a timely intervention into the conversation about what we can do. And the list of contributors is absolutely incredible. And I'm so honored to be, a small part of this project. Honored to have many of my own intellectual mentors in this work contribute to the volume. Folks like Mariam Kaba, Dorothy Roberts, Beth Ritchie, Sarah Tyson, Maya Schenwar, my co-editor, and the list goes on and on. So the work of parenting toward abolition, in short, is basically us trying to figure out and think through together what it means to, to show up, right? What does it mean to be present? What does it mean to engage each other in this work, to do this knowing that we're facing all of these horrible, policies and systems. So yeah, I think that, if I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, it does. I want to talk a little bit about my own personal revelatory experience where I had a relationship that actually, a relationship that I had for as long as I can remember. A young man, he was born 10 months before I was born, and his mother and my mother were best friends. So I was very much a part of his life from the day I was born. His mom would be babysitting me, or my mom would be babysitting him. And we grew up together almost as if we were brother and sister. But he was arrested and for a low-level, nonviolent, non-sexual, drug-related crime. And it was during he was in Washington, D.C., visiting friends. And the home where he was visiting, there were drugs there, and he was arrested. And the arrest and the conviction, the drugs were pinned on him. It was a relatively small amount of cocaine. He was encouraged to cop a plea by his public defender. He didn't want to cop a plea. He wanted to have a jury trial. Now this is in when judges were discretion a lot of their discretionary authority was taken away from them. And so this is in the late 80s. He was convicted and he got 27 years for a
Hmm.
nonviolent crime.
Yeah.
And that was my introduction into the prison system, because I would visit, and I wrote regularly, and calls, and I went to he was at Leavenworth, and I went to visit him at Leavenworth in Kansas. And that's sort of when the blinders were removed from my eyes. And Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow, helped me to understand better. But the reason that I brought this story in is I want to talk about how I watched him evolve. He did end up dying there.
Hmm.
He ended up serving 20 years, and I was in regular communication with him for 20 years. And I watched this young man change into something different
Hmm.
after over the year. I mean, it happened slowly, it happened incrementally. I remember when I went to visit him, and he was just this big, bulking, huge muscles and all of this stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he changed in the way that he looked and the way that he spoke. And I thought to myself, if he was into his 20th year, he had really lost all connections with people. Nobody was staying in there for the long run. I was in there for the long run. And I was trying to think of what am I going to do when he gets out? Because I can't deny him a place to live. I had a home. And I thought he'd probably have to come and live with me. He couldn't really stay anywhere else. And then how could he be employed? Because now he spoke with sort of prison lingo. And how could he explain a 20-year just negative space on his resume? Where could he work? And I just started thinking of all of the ways that he was damaged and really set up to fail. There was really almost no reentry for him. And so, because our system is so punitive, it seeks retribution, unlike systems, let's say, in the Norwegian countries. I wholeheartedly support abolition, but what would it look like if we were to have a successful abolition movement? What kinds of things would we build up?
Yeah, one that's an incredibly moving story, and I'm so sorry that your friend had to die in prison. Um, and it's a familiar story as well. It's one it's repeated, so many times over and over, millions of times over and over, especially, the decades since the 80s when, three strikes
Mhm.
and these other, judicial kind of changes happened. Um, what would successful abolition look like? I think, again, in a nutshell, for me, the simplest way that I could put this is that your needs get met. Your needs get met, right? That we don't dispose of people. We don't dispose of people that we're afraid of. We don't dispose of people that we don't like. We don't dispose of people because they've caused harm. We don't dispose of people that have been criminalized. We give people supports that they need for, to address whatever, personal problems they may have. We build community, right? Because a lot of this work is, not all of this work is rooted in community, right? We often talk about the policy level and the system level, and those things are important as well, but more on in a way that's tangible, that's accessible for folks, that folks can, really wrap their head around. A lot of this work happens in community, and that's one of the things that I think one of the through lines that runs throughout our book is that each one of the invitations, each one of the offerings that is included in there provides folks with different access points to thinking about what this could look like where they are, beginning with very, very little or nothing, right? Like, you don't need to be a well-resourced social service organization, or you don't need to found a nonprofit organization to start doing this work. That this is work that you can start doing at home, that you can start doing with your interpersonal relationships. You mentioned at the beginning, you showed up, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's another one of our contributors and an intellectual mentor for me, very wisely said, a while back, that abolition is presence, right? And you demonstrated that. You were there for your friend. You showed up, you wrote letters, you were thinking through what a reentry plan might look like. You were willing to open up your home if that was necessary, provide, him the supports that were needed in order for him to successfully transition. What that also reveals, though, is that the system is a failure. Right? The system is a failure. The system that is supposed to, quote unquote, rehabilitate folks does absolutely nothing. Anyone who gets rehabilitated does so in spite of this system. And because they have community support, people on the outside and folks on the inside that they're collaborating with, right? Who help them navigate the system and get through it, right? Not just survive it, but overcome it, right? And to whatever extent. And I don't want to romanticize this idea of, oh, you overcome your difficult circumstances, because I think that that's part of the problem too. And I feel that, what abolition or what abolitionists are proposing, at least the folks in our book, is to, begin small, right? To think about this, in very intimate ways. You can't get any more intimate than in a relationship with your child, right? With young people that you have responsibility for, that you're attending to. If you're a teacher, if you're a caregiver in any capacity, whether you're an auntie or, a grandma or whatever, you have responsibility and charge for young people in your life, and elders too, right? Like, we have to include elders in this caregiving, definition. So our hope is that folks will recognize that the contributions in the book provide them with access points to thinking about how they can engage, beginning where they are with whatever resources they have available. And a lot of it requires creativity. It requires a tremendous amount of humility. It requires a willingness to fail, right? But also a willingness to try and not be afraid to try something that might seem, well, that seems so far-fetched. Why are we going to try a talking circle? Well, you need to be able to communicate with folks if you want to change things, right? And one of our contributors, Jennifer Viets, is absolutely brilliant. She's a circle keeper in Chicago. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Jennifer a few weeks ago for an upcoming episode of my podcast, Beyond Prisons. And, we talked about circle keeping and the process of circle keeping and what that can do. And one of the things that she talked about is that you hold a circle in your home because in that space, whatever that time is that you're allotting to that circle, whether it's half an hour or an hour, and you're setting, certain parameters for being in that circle with people that you care about, who've also agreed, they've consented to taking part in this process, that those folks are there. And this is a way for you to practice doing the kind of communication you would like in the rest of the world, right? That we don't get to do, whether we're in a workplace or whether we're at school and, these other spaces. We get to try that out, right, at home. And you get to try it out and create safety within, that little bubble with those few people that you've agreed to, show up for, and say, okay, we're going to talk about this, whether it's a check-in, whether it's, you're responding to some sort of harm, whether it's just, holding a monthly family meeting about, how do we like the way things are run in our home, right? Whatever you're holding that circle for, that's up to you. If it could be a grief circle as well. And I've been part of most of those kinds of circles, and in different spaces and at different times. And I think that, at least for me, seeing the power of what that can do with a handful of people, it's like, okay, well, that's an easy thing for us to duplicate, right? That's an easy thing that we can replicate wherever we are. And it might be uncomfortable in the beginning, and it might feel like really weird. And it's like, oh, this isn't the pivotal, life-changing, this isn't the photo op, right? Like, people want something big and explosive and, what have you. And it's like, that's not where most of what I think the most radical work is happening, right? The most radical work is really subtle. It's quiet. It's happening behind the scenes. It's happening away from cameras and away from social media. Those things matter too, right? I don't want to minimize that. Those things matter as well. But showing up, being present for folks, thinking through how we're going to do this life thing together, because life is hard. Life is hard. We got to find ways, right? And be creative and maneuver this whole thing and say, you know what? I'm going to keep showing up for you. And I know it's difficult.
Wow, wow. That's amazing. As you were talking about the circles, I was just rereading a book. I think it's called The Spider and the Starfish, and they were talking about non-hierarchical organizations and how circles play a role in creating, helping to flatten an organization and share space and share ownership, and how the circle just kind of sets you up for peer to peer, for everyone being valued. And so that's interesting, because I think that was just like the night before last that I was reading about that. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, my goodness. So I would love to interview her. We've met a few times. We actually had her to come and speak a couple of times at different events. She's just such a powerful intellect. And the next thing that I was thinking as you were talking about that is, can we bring this whole way of thinking to scale? And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what is your opinion, because like you said, change, radical change, most radical change, it happens subtly, incrementally. It's not these big moments that you're going to see on MSNBC or how, but the change that we need to make in the society is so fundamental, down in the roots. Do you see us being able to affect change, this kind of change, even considering adopting an abolition framework? Can you envision us doing that as a nation? Not just the people who are impacted. It's usually the people who are impacted or are directly impacted, because I think everybody is impacted. The entire country is impacted. But those of us who are directly impacted are generally the ones that are involved in this kind of work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that I think that's an important question to ask in this particular moment. But what I would say is that, yes, obviously, as an abolitionist, I believe that this is a vision that is, scalable, right? Like this is something that is not just relegated to a kind of fringe or niche, group, and it's not just a few people, that this is a massive global, international, transnational solidarity movement against these sort of fascist, not sort of, but against these
Yes,
fascist, white
yes.
supremacist, settler colonial genocidal systems. It's not just a few people, right? That we can't talk about, things like parenting justice and not talk about a free Palestine, that those
Mm,
two things are intertwined, right?
yes.
That anyone who's been involved in abolition work for any significant amount of time and has engaged in political education, communal study, understands the links between, what is happening in Gaza and what is happening, in whatever street USA, right? That it's the same kind of logics that are informing, the oppression there as much as the oppression here. And you said it, it's like we're all impacted, right? Whether we recognize that we're impacted or not is the thing, right?
Yeah.
The conditions, the material conditions under which we live, love, and labor under, really do matter. And what that reveals, for us as, again, abolitionists, is that we can't ignore the fact that, our education system has been gutted. We can't ignore the fact that we have these horrible, absolutely dehumanizing policies against, houseless folks here in LA and across the country. Like it's awful, right? The idea, the fact that we can wrap our heads around, right? Saying you don't deserve a place to live. You don't
Mhm.
deserve a place to sleep because you don't have work or because of this or that or the other. That says something about where we are, right? And the way to combat that and the way that a lot of us work through a lot of that, because no one comes out perfectly formed as an abolitionist. That's nonsense, right? Like let's dispense with the kind of fantasy and the mythologizing around, what this work involves. We do this work, we do it imperfectly, we show up, we engage in study, we read a lot, and that is I know a lot of folks may not be like, oh my gosh, that's not the sexy work, right? That's not the work that people want to do. They want to get out in the streets and do all of that. Those are strategies, right? Those are strategies. You have to know when to apply those strategies, but you have to study when that matters. This is why, again, I always encourage folks, find a political home, right? Find a political home. This is how you scale this up. This is how you make this go viral. This is how you engage other people. We have very few connections with folks in our own communities because, one, the way things are designed, right? It's like you have to be intentional about doing your.
Uh-oh.
What are the things that you're missing, right? A lot of the contributors to the book talk about that. That's how they started. They started with, an idea that regarding something that was missing in their community, in their lives, and they're responding to that. Right. And they're saying, okay, well, we don't have childcare, or childcare is very expensive and inaccessible to a lot of folks. Why don't we create a collective around childcare and come together and find ways to, support each other, right? And that doesn't seem like the most revolutionary work, but when you think about who is impacted by that, one, the children are impacted, right? A lot of this work is gendered work, it's gendered labor. So if the women are, women or women identifying folks are the ones who are mostly impacted, it matters that they get a break, that they don't have to cook every single night, right? It matters. It matters tremendously to, one, their own overall health and well-being, their level of stress, the way that they can show up for themselves, for their children, in their work, in their community, and all of these other things. So what may seem, like, oh, well, you have to be involved in these big movement, kind of things, or in these big I'm going to use the word spectacle, but spectacle, in terms of, the display, right? The things that are visible to folks that get people out there. Those things are absolutely important. But again, those things are part of a broader strategy. A lot of the other work, including all of the care work that goes into putting together, a mass protest, especially an organized mass protest, that's caregiving work, right? And if we exclude a lot of people who have, children, folks, who are attending to elders and what have you, if those folks are not part of that conversation, if disabled people can't be part of that conversation or part of that, action, what are we really doing? Our work is not very revolutionary in that way. So I encourage folks to find a political home, engage in communal study. Don't think about that as, an extra thing. That is the thing. You have to understand why, certain things failed in the past. I feel like, I've been thinking a lot about this and I've been writing about this, that failure is a revolutionary praxis. We have to understand the reason we study revolutions is to understand not only what worked, but why they didn't work, right? In a
Oh,
lot of ways. And that not working is a lesson for us, or a set of lessons that we can carry forth into our own work. You don't just show up and say, well, I have a set of solutions, when you don't understand what the problem is. You
oh,
have to
girl.
understand what is
I
happening.
was just say, preach, preach. It's like somebody showing up and they say, "Oh, I can fix that." Know nothing about it. Know nothing about the origins of the problem. Know nothing about how it evolved to be what it is. You cannot dismantle something. You don't even know what you're dismantling. It's just, yeah.
And the other thing, and this is something that abolitionists talk about a lot, is that, we want to dismantle a lot of these systems, right? But if you come up with solutions, you might be coming up with solutions without having understood the real problem that only reinforce the systems that you're saying or that you're claiming you want to destroy. That doesn't get us anywhere, right? That doesn't get us any further down the line. It doesn't help us. And that kind of, we understand that the work is incremental, right? We understand that, there are points in time where big things are happening, but for the most part, the wins are small. right? The wins are small, and we have to recognize that. And we have to keep doing that work and keep showing up. And again, keep studying and keep understanding and refining our analytical lenses so that we're not just, out here just doing stuff for the sake of doing things that lead to nothing, right? To
Right.
lead nowhere.
That's right. Well, you've mentioned a couple of people who have contributed to the book, and I think that we should say that this is a book that is a compilation of writings from several writers. Do you know how many people have contributed?
The anthology includes about 30 writers. I am one of them. Maya Schenwar, my co-editor, is also another one. I mentioned a few folks earlier: Beth Ritchie, Dorothy Roberts, Anya Tanya Vudi. Oh goodness, I'm going to forget everyone now.
No, don't, no, no, don't. No, they're all brilliant. And what I'll do is when I put this thing together, generally what I do is when I do a video, we're speaking, but then I'll throw up some slides. I'll throw up the cover of the book, and where they can find the book, which of course won't be available until November the 19th.
But
And
you can pre-order it now. The
yes, and
folks.
I have done that. I
Oh,
have.
wow. Okay. I know I'm getting messages from folks that have already received the book, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm still working from the galley, right? So a lot of the book is at the warehouse. Hmm.
I'm gonna say at least 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
I,
wow.
I haven't gotten anything.
You should be getting yours soon.
Okay. All right, because I'm excited and can't wait to get it. And I'm hoping that Maya will also join me in an interview at a later time because she couldn't make it. She had a conflict in her schedule. Why don't we talk a little bit before we close? I want to talk a little bit about your podcast.
Oh, sure. Well, I produce and co-host the Beyond Prisons podcast. We are in our eighth, going into our ninth year, which is hard to believe. And it's a podcast on incarceration and prison abolition. We explore a lot of different issues. We talk about, prison abolition. We try to amplify and center the voices of folks that are directly impacted, and we think of that in a very broad kind of definition. We've interviewed a lot of folks on the podcast, and have covered, whether it's been the hunger strike and other, campaigns, like specific campaigns around addressing the harms of incarceration, to, thinking through. I'm interviewing now many, if not all, of the contributors at some point or another. I hope to have interviewed everyone that's contributed to the book, for a new series that launched about a month ago called Lessons from the Garden. And it's basically it's a supplement to the book, right? So the first episode started with some dear friends, comrades of mine who live in South LA, and have been part of that South LA community for a very long time. Alejandro Villalpando and Susana Paras. Alex is a professor and Susie is a social worker. And they do incredible work, absolutely incredible work. And that conversation just really, I've never had so many people reach out to me after we published an episode to say, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, that was amazing. Oh my gosh, I'm listening to it again. Or I had to reach for the tissues. You're warned, you need it, but it's all in a good way, right? Like they really uh, get at and talk about, not only the love that they have for each other, their experiences with parenting their child, how they were parented by their parents, but also how they're having to reparent themselves, right? And their relationships with their parents and relationships with their ancestors. So it's such a beautiful, wide-ranging conversation about so many different things that we talk about in the book, that they talk about in their essay. But it's not a book report, right? It's a supplement to, and it amplifies many of those issues, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I'm harping about it because it's such a moving conversation, and I've listened to it a bunch of times already. another episode in that series is with a dear friend of mine and longtime organizer. And I also consider him one of my intellectual mentors as well, Dylan Rodriguez. And, folks may know Dylan Rodriguez from his work with critical resistance and, and a number of other, collectives, formations and what have you. And we talk about, his essay, but also his it's a very humorous and serious conversation about, about parenting and his experience as a father, right? Being a father to two kids who are very much, you know, um, in different points in their lives, right? And want to question everything, right? And push back and really get him to think about what, his role is as a parent, what his relationship is as a parent. And the reason I appreciate that conversation with Dylan is because, when he talks about parenting, he doesn't wax poetic about, oh my goodness, this was just like this nicest thing ever. And it's like, no, he talks about the realities, how hard it is, right? The difficulties, the hurt that he feels sometimes, from his own kids, in terms of, what they're experiencing in their lives and what have you. But he does so with, incredible humor, and humility, right? And humility. And that's also one of the through lines that runs through most of the essays, but also the conversations that I've been having with folks on the podcast. So I hope folks will tune in, check out the series and, listen to the other episodes. I've had folks reach out to me recently that have learned about the book and were like, oh, I went back and started listening, to the first episode. And I was just like, how does it sound, like 8 years later? And you're like, it's still relevant. Like a lot of this isn't the issues that we talk about on a podcast are not time sensitive. They're not going away.
Evergreen. Sadly, they're evergreen.
Yeah.
And I love your podcast. And so I'm going to be putting Beyond Prisons. I'm going to be putting links to the book and to the podcast as well. Um, we had an election yesterday. I started this conversation talking about that. And one of the people who was running for the California Assembly District 52, is a young man by the name of Frankie Carrillo. And Frankie was arrested when he was 16 for the murder of a man who didn't live far from Frankie, but Frankie was nowhere near this murder scene when the murder occurred. He was at home, I believe, with his dad. He was 16 years old, and he and his dad had the utmost faith in our justice system. So he had a public defender, and he went along with what the public defender said to do, and he absolutely was nowhere near the murder, and he ended up getting convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And he was 16, tried as an adult. He ended up serving 20 years. He wrote to everyone, and he did get out and started out the Innocence Project. I believe the Innocence Project initially helped him, but then he connected with a public interest law firm, and they got him out. He was able to sue LA County because there was exculpatory evidence that was withheld. There was all kinds of shenanigans. People in power knew that he had nothing to do with it, but rather than do the right thing, they would try to hide that evidence because we know, how that happens. Well, Frankie was running for the Assembly District 52, and I happen to live in that district. And he would have been my assembly representative. I had a fundraiser for him, but he didn't win. So I just created, for the LA Progressive, I just created a election results article that my husband and I posted this morning. He didn't win. Several others did. My son was running for city council. My son didn't win. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But I thought that Frankie, who was the only person running for the California Assembly, there are 80 Assembly District representatives, and none of them have any kind of connection to the prison industrial complexes, which is what it is. But Frankie had 20 years there, and Frankie understood that he was completely innocent, and he was a child, and he understood what this system does once they've got their grips on you. And I thought that we needed somebody like that in the legislative body. that has that kind of insight. So hopefully you'll run again.
Mm.
Hopefully the work that you do, and like you said, I do it too, and I didn't even really consider that that's what I do too. I'm encouraging everyone to read your book, We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition, written along with Maya Schenwar, Kim Wilson, and it is a collection of voices, and well, the ones that you've told me so far, they're all brilliant women. So are they all women?
No, not all, not
Okay.
all, but many. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that I think that it speaks volumes.
Yeah. Well, Kim Wilson, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Same. Thank you so much for having me, Sharon. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd like to do it again sometime, especially, after the book is out. I want to
That
see
would
how
be
it's
amazing.
received.
Yeah,
Great.
that would be amazing.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
long.
Take care.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.